The music had barely started again when the air inside the ballroom still felt heavy, as if the embarrassment and tension refused to fade. Margaret stood near the center of the room pretending everything was fine, but her hands trembled as she tried to wipe the red wine stain from her expensive gown. She forced a smile and told her guests, "It's nothing, really." But her voice wavered. Everyone knew it wasn't nothing. The scene she had created with Elena had left an uncomfortable silence hanging between the laughter and the clinking glasses. Elena, meanwhile, walked quietly toward the service corridor, her torn sleeve brushing against her arm. Her heart ached, not because of the insult itself, she had faced worse before, but because it happened so publicly, so unfairly. She had tried to help, yet she was treated as if she didn't matter. Still, she told herself to stay calm. She didn't want to lose her job. She took a deep breath and went back to her duties with the same grace as before, but Margaret couldn't let it go. Her pride had been wounded and she needed someone to blame. When she noticed Elena serving at another table, she raised her voice again, saying to her friends, "I can't believe they hire such careless people here. Look at her, does she even know what professionalism means?" Her words cut through the air, loud enough for others to hear. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. People like Margaret were used to being feared, not corrected. Elena heard her but didn't react. She kept her back straight, her expression calm, though her chest tightened with pain. Her mother's words echoed in her mind again. "Never fight fire with fire, my child. Let dignity be your answer." She smiled faintly and continued serving, even as Margaret's laughter followed her across the room. But destiny has its way of turning things around when least expected. Just as the tension reached its quiet peak, the grand double doors of the ballroom opened again. The music softened as a man in a tailored navy suit entered, his confident stride drawing every eye in the room. He was tall, with kind but commanding eyes and a presence that made people straighten when he passed. The manager rushed to greet him, whispering something quickly before stepping aside respectfully. Margaret turned to look, her irritation fading for a moment. "Who is that?" she asked one of her friends, lowering her voice. "He looks familiar." Her friend whispered back, "That's David Kingston, one of the event's main sponsors. He's one of the biggest donors tonight." Margaret's mood shifted instantly. She adjusted her hair, stood up straighter, and put on her practiced charming smile. "Oh, I've heard of him," she said with a hint of excitement. "A self-made millionaire, isn't he? Maybe I'll go thank him personally for supporting the charity." She had no idea what fate had planned for her next. Across the room, Elena's eyes widened slightly when she saw the man. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to arrive so early. David noticed her immediately, his expression softening. He excused himself from the manager and walked straight toward her. Margaret noticed the direction of his gaze and frowned. "Why is he looking at the waitress?" she whispered to her friend. "That's strange." David reached Elena and spoke softly, his voice full of concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, gently touching her arm where her uniform was torn. "I came as soon as I finished the meeting. You look upset." Before Elena could respond, Margaret's curiosity turned to confusion and then disbelief. "Wait," she said loudly, taking a step forward. You know her?" David turned to face her, his calm eyes now sharp with quiet strength. "Know her?" he repeated. "She's my wife." The room fell completely silent. You could almost hear the sound of Margaret's pride shattering into 1,000 pieces. Her face turned pale, her lips parted, but no words came out. Around her, the guests stared in astonishment, realizing the woman Margaret had insulted was not just a waitress. She was the wife of the very man who had funded the entire evening. David looked around the room, his voice steady but full of authority. "I saw what happened here," he said, "and I can't stay silent when someone is treated with such disrespect. My wife deserves better, and so does everyone who works hard and is looked down upon for it." Margaret tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but no words could erase what she had done. Her perfect image, built on pride and appearances, began to crumble in front of everyone. Elena, however, stood quietly beside her husband, her calm presence shining brighter than any diamond in that room. In that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that true class wasn't worn on the body, it lived in the heart. The evening was warm and the city lights shimmered like gold dust scattered across the skyline. Inside the grand ballroom of the Royal Crescent Hotel, everything sparkled. The chandeliers, the laughter, the polished silverware. It was one of those nights when everyone wanted to be seen, and no one wanted to be forgotten. Margaret, the hostess of the night, had spent weeks preparing for this charity dinner. She wore a floor-length white gown that shimmered every time she moved, and her diamond necklace caught the light like fire. She loved attention, the glances, the compliments, the whispers that followed her. To her, image was everything. Guests began to arrive dressed in their finest clothes. Laughter echoed through the room as glasses clinked and soft music played in the background. Waiters and waitresses moved gracefully between the tables, carrying trays filled with drinks and appetizers. Among them was Elena, a woman with a calm presence and a gentle smile. She had been working at the hotel for a few years, and everyone respected her for her kindness and professionalism. Her dark skin glowed softly under the golden lights, and her posture carried quiet confidence. Elena didn't belong to the wealthy world that filled the ballroom, but she carried herself with a grace that made people notice her. Some of the guests smiled politely as she served them, but others, like Margaret, barely acknowledged her. To Margaret, the staff were invisible, people who existed only to make her evening perfect. As the night continued, the atmosphere grew lively. The smell of roasted salmon and freshly baked bread filled the air. A jazz band played softly in the corner and couples began to dance. Margaret was in her element, greeting people, laughing loudly, showing off her charm. She made sure everyone knew she had donated a large amount to the charity. It wasn't about helping others for her. It was about being admired. Elena, meanwhile, worked quietly, refilling glasses and serving dishes with a soft "thank you" and a smile. She noticed how Margaret often looked her up and down, as if judging her for existing in the same space. But Elena didn't react. She had dealt with that kind of attitude before. Her mother used to tell her, "Dignity is not something anyone can take from you unless you let them." At one point, Margaret was surrounded by her friends, boasting about her designer dress, a limited edition piece imported from Italy. She loved to talk about fashion and luxury because it made her feel superior. "This dress cost more than some people make in a month," she said with a proud laugh. Her friends laughed too, though a few looked uncomfortable. Elena passed by with a tray of drinks. One of Margaret's friends smiled kindly and took a glass, but Margaret didn't even look at her. Instead, she waved her hand dismissively and continued her conversation. But fate, as it often does, was quietly preparing a moment that would change everything. A few minutes later, as Margaret gestured dramatically while speaking, her elbow hit the edge of her wine glass. The red liquid spilled across her pristine white gown. Gasps filled the air. The deep red stain spread quickly, turning her elegant dress into a mess. For a moment, Margaret froze. Then anger boiled inside her. Her pride, her image, all of it was ruined in seconds. And when she saw Elena standing nearby with a towel, ready to help, she immediately assumed it was her fault. Without thinking, Margaret shouted, "Look what you've done! Do you even know how much this dress costs?" The music stopped. All eyes turned toward her. Elena, startled but calm, tried to explain. "Ma'am, it wasn't me. Your glass," but Margaret didn't let her finish. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice sharp and cruel. "You people never take responsibility. This is why you shouldn't be allowed near decent guests." The room went silent. Elena's face tightened, but she didn't cry. She simply stood there holding the towel, trying to keep her composure. Margaret, fueled by rage and embarrassment, grabbed Elena's sleeve, and in that impulsive moment tore a piece of her uniform. Gasps filled the room again. Even Margaret's friends looked horrified. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint clink of a dropped spoon. Margaret suddenly realized everyone was watching her, not admiring her this time, but staring with disbelief and judgment. Elena slowly stepped back, her eyes filled with quiet strength. She didn't shout or insult Margaret back. She simply whispered, "You shouldn't have done that," and walked away, leaving Margaret standing there, trembling with anger and humiliation. The laughter that once filled the ballroom had vanished. People whispered to each other, some shaking their heads. Margaret tried to regain her composure, dabbing at her stained dress, pretending as if nothing had happened. But deep down, she knew the evening had changed. Something inside her prideful world had just cracked, and what was about to happen next would break it completely. A stunned silence spread through the ballroom like a wave no one dared to interrupt. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as everyone tried to process what had just happened. A few whispered gasps floated across the room. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the music faltered as the pianist's hands hesitated on the keys. Margaret stood frozen in place. Her once perfect smile had vanished, replaced by disbelief. The color drained from her face as David's words echoed in her mind. "She's my wife." It was as if someone had pulled the rug from beneath her world of arrogance and pride. For years, she had measured worth in wealth, clothing, and status. But in that instant, she realized that everything she believed made her superior had just been exposed as meaningless. Elena stood beside her husband, her torn sleeve the only sign of the cruelty she had endured minutes earlier. She wasn't angry anymore. She simply looked calm, too calm, in fact, for someone who had been humiliated in front of a crowd. That quiet strength in her eyes made Margaret's shame feel heavier than any public scolding could have. Some guests exchanged nervous glances. Others looked down, uncomfortable with their own silence during Margaret's earlier outburst. They had watched, but no one had spoken up. Now, faced with the truth, a few began whispering apologies to Elena, or simply lowering their heads, guilt written across their faces. David, still composed, wrapped his arm protectively around his wife. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of authority. "I was watching from the corridor," he said evenly. "I saw everything. It's amazing how quickly people forget their manners when they believe someone is beneath them." Margaret tried to recover, forcing a laugh that trembled at the edges. "Oh, I had no idea she was your wife," she stammered. "I thought she was just a staff member." David's eyes narrowed slightly, though his tone remained steady. "Just a staff member?" he repeated, his voice cutting through her excuse like a knife through glass. "And if she were? Would that make it acceptable to treat her like that?" The silence deepened again. The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Margaret's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her friends shifted awkwardly beside her, clearly wanting to disappear. The once proud hostess who had filled the room with her laughter now stood small and trembling in front of the very people she had hoped to impress. Elena gently touched her husband's hand, signaling him to stop. Her eyes were kind, though tired. "It's all right," she said softly. "Let's not make a scene. It's already done." But David shook his head. "No, my love. Sometimes silence only protects the wrong people." His words carried not anger, but deep disappointment, a kind that reached every corner of the room. One of the guests finally stepped forward, breaking the tension. "Mr. Kingston, I think your wife showed more grace than most of us would in her place," he said quietly. A few nodded in agreement, and a murmur of support rose from the crowd. Margaret could feel her reputation slipping away. Everything she'd built, the admiration, the attention, the illusion of class, was dissolving before her eyes. "I didn't mean any harm," she whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. Elena turned to her and said gently, "Maybe not. But sometimes it's not about what we mean. It's about what we choose to see in others." The simple truth of that statement hit harder than any angry accusation. A few guests even clapped softly, not out of mockery but out of respect. Elena's dignity in that moment shone brighter than the glittering chandeliers overhead. Margaret lowered her gaze, her hands clutching her stained dress. For the first time that evening, she felt truly exposed, not because of the spilled wine or torn fabric, but because the ugliness of her own heart had been revealed for everyone to see. David led Elena toward the exit, his hand resting protectively on her back. The crowd stepped aside silently, parting as if royalty were passing through. And in a way they were, not the kind of royalty made of money or status, but the kind built on integrity, compassion, and respect. As the doors closed behind them, the room remained hushed. Margaret stood alone, her once perfect evening shattered beyond repair, and though the music started again minutes later, it sounded hollow, because everyone there knew they had just witnessed a moment that would linger far longer than any song or dinner ever could. The ballroom slowly emptied after the shocking revelation, but the story didn't end that night. It was only beginning. By the next morning, whispers about the charity dinner incident had spread through the city's social circles like wildfire. Every cafe conversation, every private club meeting, every luxury boutique had someone talking about how Margaret, the elegant hostess, had humiliated a woman she thought was a waitress, only to learn that the woman was the wife of a millionaire donor. Margaret woke up to dozens of missed calls and messages. Her social media was flooded with comments, some sympathetic but most criticizing her arrogance. She felt sick reading the words classless, racist, and disgraceful. Her perfect image, built carefully over years of charity events and magazine features, was crumbling faster than she could control. She wanted to believe it was gossip, that it would blow over, but deep down, she knew the truth had already escaped her control. Meanwhile, Elena and David sat together at their breakfast table in their quiet suburban home. The morning sunlight spilled across the room, golden and peaceful. Elena sipped her coffee, still thinking about the night before. She wasn't angry anymore, just sad. "I didn't want it to turn into a scene," she said softly. "I just wanted to finish my work and go home." David looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "You handled it better than anyone else could," he said. "You didn't raise your voice once. That kind of grace can't be taught." Elena smiled faintly but shook her head. "I wasn't trying to be graceful. I was just tired of proving myself. People see my skin and make assumptions before I even speak." David reached for her hand. "You don't need to prove anything," he said firmly. "The people who judge you say more about themselves than about you." As they spoke, David's phone buzzed with a message from one of the charity board members. It read, "We're sorry about what happened last night. The board has decided to issue a formal apology to your wife." Another message followed almost immediately. "Margaret has been removed from next month's hosting committee." David sighed and put his phone down. "It looks like the world is finally realizing who the real woman of class was last night," he said with a hint of irony. Elena didn't smile. She didn't want revenge or pity. She just wanted people to learn something from what had happened, to treat others better next time. Across town, Margaret sat in her grand living room, still wearing her nightgown, her makeup from the night before smudged around her eyes. The curtains were drawn, but she could still hear her phone buzzing. She didn't want to look at it anymore. Every headline made her stomach twist. "High society hostess shames waitress at charity event. Kindness exposes class," and "The millionaire who stood up for his wife." She finally turned off her phone and stared at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time, she didn't see a beautiful woman or a powerful hostess. She saw someone small, hollow, and scared. "What have I become?" she whispered to herself. Her eyes welled with tears. But they weren't for her reputation. They were for the person she had lost somewhere along the way. Days passed, and the world moved on. But the lesson lingered. Margaret stopped attending parties. She started volunteering quietly at a local shelter, away from the cameras, away from her former friends who now avoided her name. She didn't do it for redemption. She did it because the emptiness inside her demanded change. One afternoon, as she helped pack boxes at the shelter, she saw a familiar figure walk in. It was Elena, dressed simply, smiling kindly as she handed out supplies. Their eyes met for a long moment. Margaret froze, unsure whether to speak or walk away. But Elena walked up to her, her expression soft, not angry. "Hi," Elena said gently. "It's good to see you here." Margaret swallowed hard. "You're not angry with me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Elena shook her head. "No. You taught me something too, that sometimes people need to fall before they see where they stand." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak, and in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something like forgiveness. And in that moment, it was no longer about shame, pride, or wealth. It was about two women standing in the same place, both changed forever by one night that had started with spilled wine, but ended with a lesson in humanity neither would ever forget. The sunlight slanted through the windows of the shelter a few weeks later, warm and golden, as if the world had finally decided to calm down after the storm. Life had started to move forward again. But the echoes of that night at the charity dinner still lingered in the air like a story everyone had heard, but no one could forget. For Elena and David, life had settled back into its quiet rhythm. They spent their mornings together over coffee and laughter, and their evenings taking long walks through their neighborhood hand in hand. Yet, despite the peace around her, Elena often found herself thinking about Margaret, not with anger anymore, but with a strange mixture of pity and curiosity. She wondered if Margaret had truly changed, or if she was simply hiding behind silence. One Sunday morning, while helping organize a fundraising event for the shelter, Elena was reviewing guest registrations when a familiar name caught her eye: Margaret Henson. For a moment, Elena froze. Her first instinct was disbelief. But then she smiled softly, understanding that fate had once again arranged an unexpected meeting. When the day of the event arrived, the shelter buzzed with energy. Volunteers laughed as they arranged food baskets, children played outside, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Among the crowd, Margaret stood quietly near a table, wearing a simple blue dress. No diamonds, no designer handbag, no entourage. She looked different, almost unrecognizable. There was no trace of arrogance, only humility. Her eyes, once sharp, with judgment, now carried a softness that came from regret. When Elena noticed her, their eyes met across the room. This time, Margaret didn't look away. She walked over slowly, her steps hesitant but steady. "Elena," she began softly, her voice trembling just enough to reveal her nerves. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me again." Elena smiled gently. "I didn't expect to, but I'm glad you came." For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the shelter faded into the background as they stood there. Two women who had once been on opposite sides of dignity and pride, now facing each other as equals. Margaret lowered her gaze. "I don't have excuses," she said. "What I did that night was unforgivable. I thought I was above you because of money and status. But the truth is, I was the one who had nothing inside. You showed me that." Elena took a deep breath, studying her face. She could see the sincerity, the weariness, the quiet ache of someone who had learned their lesson the hard way. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we all need a moment that forces us to see who we really are." Margaret's eyes welled up. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness, I came to thank you, because that night ruined my reputation, but it saved my soul." For the first time, Elena reached out and gently took her hand. "Maybe it didn't ruin anything," she said. "Maybe it fixed something that was broken long before." A small smile touched Margaret's lips, fragile but real. "You know," she said quietly, "for weeks I kept asking myself why your husband didn't yell, why you didn't shout back. But now I understand. Power doesn't need to scream. It only needs to stand tall." They talked for a while, not about the past, but about the work they were doing now, the families they were helping, the children they wanted to support. It was as if life had handed them a second chance, one built on understanding rather than pride. Later that afternoon, David arrived to pick Elena up. When he saw Margaret, he paused for a second, surprised but calm. Margaret turned to him and said humbly, "Mr. Kingston, I owe both of you an apology. I judged your wife without knowing her, and in doing so I revealed the worst part of myself. I'm truly sorry." David nodded slowly. "The best apology is change," he said kindly. "And I can see you've already started." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "I'm trying." As Elena and David walked toward the door, Margaret watched them go, feeling something she hadn't felt in years: peace. For the first time, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't hiding behind wealth or appearances. She was simply herself. Human, imperfect, but growing. Outside, the sun was setting in a soft orange glow, painting the sky with forgiveness. And as Elena looked back one last time, she realized something beautiful. Sometimes life doesn't punish people to destroy them. It humbles them to rebuild them stronger, kinder, and truer than before. Weeks rolled by, and autumn painted the city in shades of gold and rust. The charity incident had slowly faded from the gossip columns, but its lessons remained alive in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. People still remembered the night a proud woman's arrogance was stripped bare, and how grace had triumphed without anger or revenge. For Elena and David, life carried on peacefully. They were busy running their community projects, helping small businesses and supporting education programs for underprivileged children. Their story had quietly inspired many, though neither of them ever spoke of that night again. Elena had long since moved past the hurt, but life had a curious way of reminding her that the world was still watching. One crisp evening, Elena was invited to speak at a leadership conference about kindness in modern society. She hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't her comfort zone, but David encouraged her. "Your voice matters," he told her. "You don't need to be loud to be heard." The hall was full when Elena stepped onto the stage. The audience, business leaders, teachers, and volunteers, waited eagerly. She began softly. "We live in a world where it's easy to see status, not soul. But sometimes the smallest acts of humility can teach the biggest lessons." Her words flowed with honesty and warmth, her tone steady yet emotional. She didn't mention Margaret's name, nor did she need to. She simply told a story about dignity, about how a person can choose grace even when humiliated. "Kindness," she said, "isn't weakness, it's quiet strength. It's the choice to stand tall without stepping on anyone else." Among the audience, unnoticed at first, sat Margaret. She had learned about the conference from a mutual acquaintance and had decided to attend, quietly sitting in the back row. She listened to every word with tears in her eyes. The woman who once prided herself on being the center of attention now found healing in silence. Elena's words pierced her, not with guilt this time, but with gratitude. After the speech, the audience rose to their feet, clapping. Elena smiled shyly and stepped down from the stage. As she greeted a few attendees, she noticed Margaret walking toward her. She looked different, calmer, gentler, her posture humble yet confident. "You were amazing," Margaret said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "Your words, they were everything I needed to hear. I still don't deserve your kindness, but I'm thankful for it." Elena smiled warmly. "You do deserve kindness. We all do, as long as we're willing to learn from our mistakes." Margaret nodded, tears glimmering. "I used to think success was about what people saw, money, parties, status. But now I know success is about peace, forgiveness, and how you treat others when no one's watching." They stood together for a moment, surrounded by the soft chatter of the crowd. It was a full-circle moment, one that didn't need drama or apologies, only understanding. Later that night, as Elena and David drove home, he asked softly, "Did she talk to you?" Elena looked out the window at the city lights passing by. "Yes," she said. "And you know what? She's not the same person anymore. She's lighter now, free." David smiled. "That's the beauty of second chances." Elena nodded. Maybe that night wasn't just meant to teach her. It was meant to teach everyone that grace is more powerful than anger. Meanwhile, Margaret returned home, her heart finally quiet. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to look in a mirror to know who she was. She no longer sought approval from society. She sought peace within herself. And as she sat by her window, watching the stars glimmer above the city, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes losing everything you thought mattered is how you find what truly does." The world had judged her. Yes, but it had also given her a chance to rewrite her story. And this time, Margaret intended to live it not as a woman of wealth, but as a woman of worth. The winter winds swept softly through the city, carrying with them a quiet stillness that made the nights feel longer and the stars brighter. Months had passed since that unforgettable night at the charity dinner, but its echo still lived in the hearts of those who had been there. Time had softened the edges of the memory, but not the lessons it carried. Elena and David had just returned from a community trip overseas, where they helped launch a scholarship program for underprivileged youth. The experience had filled Elena's heart with gratitude. She had seen hope in the eyes of children who had so little, yet smiled as if they had everything. It reminded her that kindness didn't need an audience, it just needed intention. One snowy evening, as the couple settled in by the fireplace, their doorbell rang. When David opened the door, there stood Margaret, bundled in a long coat, holding a small gift box wrapped in silver paper. Her face was calm but nervous, her breath visible in the cold air. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly. I didn't know how else to say thank you." Elena smiled warmly and invited her in. Margaret hesitated at the doorway, taking in the cozy simplicity of their home. The warmth of the fire, the faint scent of cinnamon, the framed photos of family and charity events. It was elegant yet humble, so different from her own house, which was large and beautiful but often felt empty. They sat together in the living room, the silence gentle, not awkward. Margaret placed the small box on the coffee table and slid it toward Elena. "It's not much," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just something I made myself. I've been learning pottery. It helps me think. I made this for you." Elena carefully unwrapped the box. Inside was a delicate clay heart, hand-painted with the words, "Grace changes everything." It wasn't perfect, its edges were slightly uneven, but that imperfection made it beautiful. "It's lovely," Elena said softly, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," Margaret smiled weakly. "It's funny," she said. "For years I bought the most expensive things, but nothing ever made me feel whole. Now I make something with my own hands, and for the first time I feel real." David poured tea for everyone and joined them. The conversation flowed easily after that, about life, forgiveness, and the quiet ways people grow when no one's watching. Margaret told them how she had started volunteering full-time, helping women who had faced discrimination in the workplace. "I guess I wanted to give back what I once failed to give," she admitted. Elena listened, her heart full. "That's beautiful," she said. "Sometimes pain becomes our teacher and healing becomes our purpose." Margaret looked at her, eyes glistening. "You were that teacher for me, Elena. Not through anger, but through grace. I'll never forget that." For a while, the three of them sat in peaceful silence, the crackle of the fire filling the room. Snowflakes tapped softly against the windows as if the world outside wanted to share in the quiet warmth within. When it was time for Margaret to leave, Elena walked her to the door. The night air was cold, the moon bright above the snow-covered street. Margaret turned before stepping into her car. "You know," she said with a faint smile, "I used to think the world revolved around me. Now I see it revolves around what we give to it." Elena nodded, smiling gently. "That's the kind of wealth no one can take away." Margaret drove off slowly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she disappeared into the snowy night, Elena closed the door and turned to David, holding the little clay heart in her hands. "She's changed," Elena whispered. David smiled knowingly. Sometimes the coldest winters create the warmest hearts, and as the fire flickered softly behind them, the world outside continued its quiet dance of snow, washing away the past and leaving behind a story of redemption, grace, and the kind of forgiveness that heals more than one soul at a time.